Hello everyone and welcome to the first webinar. My name is Michaela Finger and I'm currently a working student at the IRT. A few months ago I did my bachelor thesis also at the IRT, where I worked with brain-computer interfaces. And today I would like to present you the results of the project we did. The title and main focus of the work was the development of a brain-computer interface for people with severe motor impairment to control a web video player. So here's a quick overview of this presentation. I will first talk a bit about the motivation why we decided to investigate this topic. Then I will go on to some necessary background information before we will come to the development part. After that, I will shortly tell you something about the implementations as well as the user study we conducted. I will end with our results and some final thoughts about the topic and possible future work. So, the inspiration for the project arose during the JavaScript conference 2018 with a talk by Charlie Gerard, who developed some basic web applications with JavaScript and took an easy-to-use EEG device to control and play around with these web applications. The motivation on the other side was especially the increasing amount of web content that people daily consume and the high demand for accessible applications and user interfaces for people with disabilities. So, two main questions arose for this research topic. First, if EEG devices can be used to control media content in the web, and second, what requirements and limitations such applications and devices still have. The main task for that was, on the one hand, to do research and explore the potential and state-of-the-art of brain-computer interfaces, and on the other side, to build a prototype application by ourselves to evaluate how easy BCIs can be implemented and how well such an application could work to control the media content. Now, let's talk a bit about the background. What are BCIs and how do they work? There are many definitions of brain-computer interfaces, but the one that is probably the most logical is to define BCIs as an interface between the brain and the computer that uses brain signals, so-called EEG, as direct source of information. Because it tries to filter these brain signals directly from the head, it avoids the use of muscles on which any natural communication usually depends on, like speech or gesture. There is one limitation though: a lot of BCIs, especially ones with more options, depend at least on a minimum of control over the eye movements. So how does it work? First, we need to have a user and an EEG device that acquires the EEG data signals from the user's brain. This EEG data is either invoked by the user itself or it is triggered with some sort of stimulus, which could for example be visual, like the blinking of a button. The acquired signal will then be processed inside the computer. That contains usually several steps, mainly the pre-processing where the signal is filtered, and after that relevant features will be extracted and classified. If the final result fits to one of the predefined commands, the corresponding command will be sent to the application and will be executed. That is then, of course, also kind of feedback for the user in the same way as we usually get feedback, for example, when we do a mouse click to trigger some action. The target group for BCIs are mainly people with severe motor impairment who cannot move any muscles in their body. This can be the result of various illnesses, for example ALS, progressive muscle dystrophies, or the so-called locked-in syndrome. Each of these diseases can have an individual progression, so the restrictions and requirements the patients face are also very individual. Therefore, it is hard to define all the requirements, but we try to summarize the most important ones that any BCI application should meet. Besides of a good recognition of the defined command, it is important to keep the required hardware to a minimum. This goes kind of hand in hand with the next point, avoiding unnecessary costs. For users to be able to use the application in everyday life, it should not have a complicated or time-consuming setup, and the EEG device that is used should be aesthetically pleasing and, of course, comfortable to wear. The EEG device we used was the same as Charlie Gerard used in her inspiring talk. It's the Emotive Epoch. It's a rather low-cost 14-channel EEG device that can be used wirelessly. It's pretty fast to set up, around 5 to 10 minutes, and it can be even faster if you're used to it. So now we come to the development of the application. In general, we wanted to evaluate if a BCI can be used to control media content in the web browser. But since media content is quite a broad term, we focused on controlling a video player. To do so, we summarized the research to 3 main concepts that are state-of-the-art and could be used for such an application. The first concept uses so-called motor imagery. That is a technique which does not require any stimulus to produce specific EEG data. The idea behind motor imagery is that the user trains a mental command. For example, he imagines that he moves his hand to the right, and after some training time, this induces a distinctive pattern that can be then extracted from the EEG signal. For our application, the user would train ideally up to 4 commands, but it could also work with less. Then it would of course be a bit slower. In the image you can see that there would be a user interface that would pop up over the video player. That could be triggered by one of the trained commands, for example the first one. Then the user could either use one pair of commands to change the action he or she wants to perform, or the other pair of commands to actually trigger the action. On the left side of the picture, the purple command would, for example, change the action that the user can perform. This could be adjusting the volume, like drawn in the left picture, or going back or forward, like drawn in the upper right side. Then with the blue commands, this action could be triggered, just like it would be when the user clicks on a physical button to adjust the volume. The second concept uses event-related potentials. This technique is one of the first techniques developed that uses visual stimulation to trigger specific EEG signals. There is one of the most famous BCI applications using this technique, a so-called P300 speller, that can be used to actually type. The idea behind that is that the user concentrates on the command she or he wants to trigger, and meanwhile all commands blink randomly in a different order and with a different time interval. When the command blinks on which the user is concentrating on, it triggers a specific potential in the user's EEG data. This can be trained and filtered until the correct commands can be classified. An interface using this technique could look like the one in the drawing you can see here, where all available commands are shown on one overlay. Of course, you would still need a method to toggle this overlay with the commands. For this, you could use one single trained command like the motor imagery commands mentioned in the first concept. The third concept uses so-called steady-state visually evoked potentials. The idea of that is similar to the second concept with the event-related potentials. It uses also visual stimulation to trigger a specific response in the EEG signal when the user concentrates on one of these stimuli. The difference to the second concept lies in the presentation of the stimuli. The idea is that each command is blinking, so its background changes, for example, from black to white and black again in a specific frequency. All commands blink simultaneously, but each command gets a different frequency, so that different signals in the brain are triggered depending on the command the user is focusing on. Just like the second concept, this also needs one internally trained command to toggle the user interface that brings up the visual stimuli. We evaluated these concepts and chose this third concept for a prototype implementation because it seemed to be much faster and a bit more precise than the other ones. So now let's talk a bit about the actual implementation, and there were some challenges that we had to overcome. One of the main challenges was the complex system of EEG processing and pre-processing that required quite special background knowledge. Unfortunately, there were also some compatibility issues between the hardware and the already existing software and toolboxes, which made it hard to test anything without implementing a lot ourselves. Another challenge was the exact presentation of the blinking stimulation, especially inside the web browser. And we also had to deal with the rather inaccurate measurements of the EEG signals, because, as I said, the hardware we used was a low-cost EEG device and not a very professional one. In the end, the architecture of our prototype implementation looked like this. We used the emotive epoch for recording EEG and acquired the signal with emotive's own interface, the cortex service that communicates via WebSockets. The main application consists of two parts, the backend and the front end. The backend gets the EEG data and does all the processing and feature extraction. This was written with Node.js. The front end is the actual web page that contains the video player and the user interface with the visual stimulation. This was written with Vue.js. The core part of the whole application is the concept behind the EEG processing. Here you can see, for example, a 4-second epoch that from a user that was concentrating on a blinking with 12 Hz. The data is already pre-processed and converted from the time spectrum into the frequency domain, so you can see the clear peak at 12 Hz. This is an ideal epoch, and unfortunately not all the data looks as clear as this one. During the implementation we used two different approaches for the feature extraction. One was more state-of-the-art and used a neural network. For this, the user had to record a training session. The data of that session was then given to the neural network and a classifier was trained. From that, you could get an individual classifier for each user that in the end should be quite precise. Disadvantages with the neural networks are the training times, which are a bit time-consuming and also exhausting due to the long exposure of the blinking. So we also came up with another classification approach. Since we know how the EEG response should look like for the different frequencies, we implemented a very basic classifier that would only look for the frequencies and did not require any previous training sessions. What's interesting is that there was not really any research literature that used this approach, even though it is fairly simple and it works also quite well. So now let's have a look at the application. This is the settings page, which cannot be controlled with the EEG device. It provides basic configuration options and you can do the training sessions to train a neural network. When you start the actual application, you first have a simple page where the user can select a video. This could of course be also more complex with more videos, but as part of the prototype it was enough for us. The main part are then the video controls. This is how the user interface looks like when it is toggled. The video in the background will get a bit darker and it will either be paused or keep playing depending on the preference of the user. The black background behind the symbols will then blink with different frequencies, and if one command is recognized, it will turn green to give additional feedback, just like you can see here in the screenshot. After the prototype was running, we also conducted a small user study. In total, there were 11 people participating, 5 female and 6 male. We did sort of 2 studies, one main study and one small additional study. And for the main study we had 9 participants, and for the additional one we had 2. The age of the participants was between 24 and 52, and all of them were healthy. Unfortunately, it was not possible to do the user study with people from the target group because the implementation was just in a too early stage, and since this was all done for the bachelor thesis, there was just not enough time. Nevertheless, the user study helped quite a lot to evaluate the application. Our goal was to get a first impression of the general usability, but also see in detail how good the command classification is. For the main study, we decided to do a qualitative user study, and it consisted of 3 parts: the explanation, the trial, and a questionnaire. And the total duration was around 1.5 hours. The first important feedback we got through the questionnaires. There was a lot of different feedback, but 4 points were mentioned the most. First, the blinking was rated as quite exhausting, especially the training sessions for the neural network. Also, the EEG device was uncomfortable for some participants. So this was more the negative feedback, but there was also some positive feedback. Almost all participants said that they are very fascinated by the concept and that it can actually work. and most of the users rated the application as logical and intuitive, so even though it was new to them, it was rather easy to use. Now, to come to the more statistical part of the study, we also evaluated the classification rate with another test session that was recorded. And for these sessions, the average classification rate was 50 to 60% with the neural network, and around 50% with the general classifier, the basic one that did not require a previously trained neural network. This could of course be much better, and if it should become a real application, it would also have to, but for our first prototype, this is quite promising. It is also interesting that there was a really big deviation between the participants. The classification rates were between 20 and 100%, and that shows that also it is not just the application that is important, but of course also the device and the general setup. We also did a small additional study, like I mentioned, that was not really planned in the beginning, but resulted in between, where we did a lot of testing. We had 2 people, me and someone else, who tested the application over a longer time. It was around 2 months, and we used the device around 2 times per week. At the end, we both had really good classification rates, always between 90 and 100%. Of course, 2 people are not enough to get a valid representation, but it is very interesting, and it shows that there might be changes in the classification rate after the person gets used to the device and the application. As one of the main disadvantages is the exhausting visual stimulation, we did another small user study where we changed the color of the blinking from black and white to red and white to decrease the contrast. We could not see a significant change in the classification rate, but the red blinking was rated as slightly more pleasant. So this point should be further investigated if someone would want to build an application based on steady-state potentials. Now, to come to the conclusion, we had 2 main questions we wanted to answer with this project. The first one was if easy-to-use EEG devices can already be used to control media content in the web. We implemented the prototype and used the low-cost EEG device, and even though neither of that was professional, the application worked and the results were quite promising. We did a lot of research, and other papers showed also very good results regarding the classification rate of a more professional setup, and there are currently also some very helpful releases of software and toolboxes. The second question was what requirements and limitations are there? And of course there are a lot of requirements and also still a lot of limitations. I will start with the limitations, and they can be grouped in 2 categories. First, there were general limitations. These are problems not only for our project but for all applications, and that was especially the comfort of the EEG device and also the exhaustion due to the fast blinking of the interface. And last, there were the compatibility issues, which made it much harder to test the device and implement an application. But this of course also depends which EEG device is used. The main limitation with our prototype was the high deviation in the classification rate. That made it hard to evaluate, especially because it was not obvious where these deviations came from. Of course, there are also always further requirements, so here are the ones we think are the most important ones. I did not mention this until now, but it is actually a very important point. We need more comparison with other assistive technologies, especially with eye tracking, to investigate how EEG could help where other devices are not yet helping. For now, eye tracking is much more suited for most end users, so we also need further research about the target group and the possible use cases to find the situations where BCI or a combination of another assistive technology with a BCI could be most useful. And to really develop useful applications, we think it is also very important to make everything regarding BCIs more compatible. As far as we know, there are no standards yet, so this would be a very important point to work on. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you a lot for listening. I hope it was interesting to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.